From the outset, the provisional government was in a troubled position. The main problem was the war. For the provincial government after February 1917, there was no choice but to fight on. The reason was not idealistic but financial. Unless it did so, it would no longer receive supplies and war credits from the Western Allies, on which it had come to rely. Tsardom had left Russia virtually bankrupt. No government could have carried on without a large injection of capital from abroad. Foreign bankers were among the first to visit Russia after Nicholas's abdication to ensure that the new regime would carry on the war. The strain that this obligation imposed on the provisional government finally proved unsustainable. Its preoccupation with the war prevented the government from dealing with Russia's social and economic problems. It was a paradoxical situation. In order to survive, the provisional government had to keep Russia in the war, but in doing so, it destroyed its own chances of survival. The question of the war brought about the first serious rift between the Petrograd Soviet and the provisional government. On March 14th, the Soviet had issued an address to the people of the whole world, calling for peace without annexations or indemnities. The government declared that it accepted the address, but this appeared at best nonsense and at worst deliberate deceit. When it became known that Milyukov, the foreign minister, had pledged to the Allies that Russia would fight on until Germany was defeated, they lost more credibility. Late in April, a series of violent demonstrations occurred in Petrograd directed against Milyukov. These produced a government crisis. Milyukov, the war minister, resigned early in May. These resignations were an illustration of the divisions within the government as well as the outside pressures on it. In the reshuffled cabinet, Alexander Kerensky became the war minister, and places were found for leading Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, or SRs. It was hoped that this apparent leftward shift of the provisional government would ease its relationship with the Soviet. However, the opposite happened. The socialists in the government tended to become isolated from the Soviet. This was because in joining the government, they had to enter into a coalition with the cadets, which opened them to a charge that they were compromising with the bourgeoisie. Lenin wrote of those despicable socialists who have sold out to the government. Some individuals within the provincial government had misgivings about continuing the war, but in no time did the government as a body contemplate withdrawing from it. This would have mattered less had Russian armies been successful, but the military situation continued to deteriorate, eroding the support the government had initially enjoyed. Lvov stayed as nominal head of the government, but it was Kerensky who became the major influence. As war minister, he campaigned for Russia to embrace the conflict with Germany as a struggle to save the revolution, requiring the total dedication of the nation. He made a number of personal visits to the front to deliver passionate speeches to the troops. He later described his efforts. For the sake of the nation's life, it was necessary to restore the army's will to die. Forward to the battle for freedom, I summon you not to a feast but death. These were the words I used before the troops in frontline positions, and I can't imagine that people felt really great about those words. This attempt to turn the war into a revolutionary crusade took no account of the real situation. The fact was that Russia had gone beyond the point where it could fight a successful war, yet Kerensky persisted. In June, a major offensive was launched on the southwestern front. It failed badly. With their already low morale further weakened by Bolshevik agitators who encouraged them to disobey orders, the Russian forces were no match for the Germans, who easily repulsed them and inflicted heavy losses. Whole regiments mutinied or deserted. General Kornilov, the commander on the southwestern front, called on the provisional government to halt the offensive and direct its energies to crushing the political subversives at home. The government's troubles were deepened by events on the island of Kronstadt, the naval base situated 15 miles west of Petrograd in the Bay of Finland. Sailors and workers there defied the central authorities by setting up their own separate government. Such developments tempted a number of revolutionaries in Petrograd into thinking that the time and opportunity had come for them to bring down the provisional government. This attempt to do so became known as the July Days. By the summer of 1917, it did indeed seem like the government was no longer in control of events. The most ominous signs were the spread of the Soviets, worker control of the factories, widespread seizure of land by the peasants, and the creation of breakaway national minority governments, most notably in the Ukraine. It was the Ukrainian question that helped to provoke the July Days crisis, when the cadet ministers in the government learned in late June that a provisional government deputation in Kiev had offered independence to the Ukrainians. They resigned, protesting that only an all-Russian Constituent Assembly could properly decide such matters. This ministerial clash coincided with the large-scale street demonstrations in Petrograd. Public protests were not uncommon. They had been almost a daily occurrence since February. But in the atmosphere created by the news of the failure of the southwestern offensive and the government's mounting problems, the demonstrations of early July turned into a direct challenge to the provisional government. The rising itself was a confused, disorderly affair. In the course of the 3 days, the demonstrators fell out amongst themselves. Those members of the Soviet who seemed reluctant to make a real bid for power were physically attacked. This disunity made it relatively easy for the provisional government to crush the rising. Troops loyal to the government were rushed from the front. They duly scattered the demonstrators and restored order. It is not entirely clear who started the rising in July. A month before, at the first All-Russian Congress of the Soviets, Lenin had declared that the Bolshevik Party was ready to take power, but the delegates had regarded this as a general intention rather than a specific plan. There were also a number of SRs and other non-Bolshevik revolutionaries in the Soviet who, for some time, had been demanding that the Petrograd Soviet take over from the provisional government. Trotsky later referred to the July Days as a semi-insurrection and argued that it had been started by the Mensheviks and the SRs. In saying this, he was trying to absolve the Bolsheviks from the blame of having started a rising that failed. The explanation offered afterwards by the Bolsheviks was that they had come heroically to the aid of the workers of Petrograd and their comrades in arms, the sailors of Kronstadt, who had risen spontaneously against the government. The opposite point of view was put at the time by a minister or chairman of the Soviet. He argued that the Bolsheviks, having been behind the rising from the beginning, later tried to disclaim responsibility for its failure. While the origins of the July Days may have been uncertain, the results were not. The abortive rising revealed a number of important facts. First, the opposition movement was disunified. Also, the Bolsheviks were still far from being the dominant revolutionary party in the Soviet, and the provisional government still had the strength to be able to put down an armed insurrection. This last revelation did much to raise the spirits of the provisional government and brought particular credit to Kerensky as war minister. 2 days after the rising had been crushed, he became prime minister. He immediately turned the heat on the Bolsheviks. Their newspaper was closed down, and many of the Bolshevik leaders, including Trotsky and Kamenev, were arrested. Lenin fled to Finland. Kerensky also launched a propaganda campaign in which Lenin and his party were branded as traitors and agents in the pay of the German High Command. About a week after the July Days, the Bolshevik Party appeared to have been broken as a political force in Russia. What enabled the Bolsheviks to survive was the critical misjudgments by the provisional government over the land question and the Kornilov affair. The provisional government had misread the public attitude towards the war. It also failed to appreciate the common view of the land question. Land shortage was a chronic problem in Russia. It had been a chief cause of peasant unrest since the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. The February Revolution had led the peasants to believe that they would soon benefit from a major land redistribution following a government takeover of the landowners' estates. When the government did no such thing, the peasants in many parts of Russia took the law into their own hands and seized the property of local landlords. Disturbances in the countryside occurred daily throughout 1917. It would be appropriate to describe this as a national peasants' revolt. The provisional government had no real answer to the land problem. While it was true that it had set up a land commission with the object of redistributing land, this body made little progress in handling a massive task. It was doubtful, moreover, whether the government's heart was really ever in land reform. The majority of its members came from the landed and the propertied classes. They were unlikely to be enthusiasts for a policy that would threaten their own position. They had supported the February Revolution as a political change, not as social upheaval. They were quite willing for the estates of the fallen monarchy to go to the peasants, but they had no intention of losing their own possessions in a state land grab. This had been the strength of Lenin's assertion in the April thesis that the Tsardom had been replaced not by a revolutionary, but by a bourgeoisie regime. There was a sense in which the land issue was equally difficult for the Bolsheviks. They simply did not have a land policy. As a Marxist party, they had dismissed the peasantry as, in Trotsky's word, the packed animal of history, lacking true revolutionary initiative. By definition, the proletarian revolution was an affair of the industrial working class. Lenin, on his return in April, had declared that it would be pointless for the Bolsheviks, a proletarian party, to make an alliance with the backward peasantry. However, faced with the fact of peasant land seizures throughout Russia, Lenin was quite prepared to make a tactical adjustment. Appreciating that it was impossible to ignore the disruptive behavior of 4/5 of the Russian population, he asserted that the special circumstances of post-Tsarist Russia had produced a situation in which the peasants were acting as a truly revolutionary force. This adaptation of Marxist theory thus allowed Lenin to add the Russian peasants to the proletarian cause. Lacking a land policy of its own, Lenin simply stole the social revolutionaries' land to the peasants. A slogan lifted straight from the SR program became the new Bolshevik catchphrase. What this meant in mid-1917 was that the Bolsheviks recognized the peasant land seizures as perfectly legitimate. This produced a considerable swing to the Bolsheviks in the countryside. It had further effect of splitting the SRs, a significant number of whom began to align themselves with the Bolsheviks. Known as left SRs, they sided with the Bolshevik Party on all major issues. In August, Kerensky's government became involved in the Kornilov affair, a crisis that undermined the gains it had made from its handling of the July days and allowed the Bolsheviks to recover from their humiliation. Parts of the story have been obscured by the conflicting descriptions later given by some of the participants, but there was little doubt as to the intentions of the chief figure in the episode, General Kornilov, the new commander-in-chief. Kornilov was a type of right-wing army officer who had never accepted the February Revolution. He believed that before Russia could fulfill its patriotic duty of defeating Germany, it must first destroy the socialist enemies within. It's time, he said, to hang the German supporters and spies, with Lenin at their head, and to disperse the Soviet. By late August, the advance of German forces deeper into Russia began to threaten Petrograd itself. Large numbers of refugees and deserters flocked into the city, heightening the tension there and increasing the disorder. Kornilov declared that Russia was about to topple into anarchy and that the government stood in grave danger of a socialist-inspired insurrection. He informed Kerensky that he intended to bring his loyal troops to Petrograd to save the provisional government from being overthrown. Accounts tend to diverge at this point in their description of Kerensky's response. Those who believe that he was involved in a plot with Kornilov to destroy the Soviet and set up a dictatorship argue that Kerensky had at first fully supported this move. It was only afterwards, when he realized that Kornilov also intended to remove the provisional government and impose military rule, that he turned against him. Other commentators sympathetic to Kerensky maintained that he had not plotted with Kornilov and that his actions had been wholly consistent. They also emphasized that a special commission of inquiry into the affair in 1917 cleared Kerensky of any complicity. But, however the question of collusion is decided, it was certainly the case that Kerensky publicly condemned Kornilov's advance. He ordered him to surrender his post and placed Petrograd under martial law. Kornilov reacted by sending an open telegram declaring, "People of Russia, our great motherland is dying. I, General Kornilov, declare that under pressure of the Bolshevik majority in the Soviets, the provisional government is acting in complete accord with plans of the German General Staff. It is destroying the army and is undermining the very foundations of the country." Fearful that Kornilov would attack, Kerensky called on all loyal citizens to take up arms to defend the city. The Bolsheviks were released from prison and came out of hiding to collect the weapons issued by the provisional government to all who were willing to fight. By this strange twist in the story of 1917, the Bolsheviks found themselves being given arms by the very government they were pledged to overthrow. As it happens, the weapons were not needed against Kornilov. The railway workers refused to operate the trains to bring Kornilov's army to Petrograd. When he learned of this and of the mass workers' militia formed to oppose him, Kornilov abandoned the advance and allowed himself to be arrested. He was to die early in April 1918, killed by a stray shell at the start of the Civil War. It was the Bolsheviks who benefited most from the failure of the attempted coup. They had been able to present themselves as the defenders of Petrograd and the revolution, thus diverting attention away from their failure in the July days. What further boosted the Bolsheviks was that, despite the obvious readiness of the people of Petrograd to defend their city, this could not be read as a sign of their belief in the provisional government. Indeed, the episode had damaged the provisional government by revealing its political weakness and showing how vulnerable it was to military threat. Kerensky later admitted that the Kornilov affair had been the prelude to the October Revolution.